With our first keynote speaker, Rawsthorn. I cannot be happier or more honored to present Rawsthorn here in Bצלאל. Rawsthorn is an award-winning design critic and the author of the critical acclaimed book Hello World. This is the book where design meets life, and I definitely urge every one of you to read every single word in this book. Her next book, Design as an Attitude, is going to be published this month, and we'll hear about it today. Alice wrote a weekly design column in the New York Times that was syndicated worldwide for over a decade. She also often speaks in design conferences, in global design events such as the International TED or the World Economic Forum in Davos. She's also a founding member of the Writers for Liberty campaign to champion human rights and freedoms, which is so important to us here in Bצלאל and in the Middle East, of course. Alice is also awarded the OBE, the Order of British Empire, for services to design and the arts. In her lecture today, Alice will discuss the current status of design and its future challenges and new opportunities. I would also like to say that Rawsthorn's lecture today is part of the Bצלאל International Lecture Series in memory of Stuart B. Young, a dear friend of Bצלאל. Until his sudden passing in 2014, Stuart Young served as a member of Bצלאl Board of Directors and was an active member in the Friends of Bצלאל organization in the USA. Committed to continuing his meaningful involvement, his wife Toni joined the Friends of Bצלאל and decided to dedicate a new international lecture series in Stuart's memory. We are very honored to be joined today by Stuart's daughter, Anne. She's here today. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for bringing Alice here. Your family is very dear to us. Thank you a lot. Thank you a lot. Alice, please.
Well, thank you, Ori, for that wonderful introduction. I feel doomed to disappoint after it. And also, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here and very honoured to have been invited to participate in the lecture series in Stuart D. Young's memory. It's a wonderful thing to do and very special for me, so thank you very much. Now, handily, the theme of my next book, Design as an Attitude, coincides very neatly with Safi's theme for the conference. And so I am going to talk about design as an attitude, which I believe is a post-industrial approach to design. And I'm going to begin with a tribute to one of my favourite figures from design history. This is the early 20th century designer, artist, and visual theorist, the wonderful Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. Now, he embodies so many of the things that I love about design, its best aspects. I mean, he was irresistible. He was a Hungarian émigré who wore a factory worker's boiler suit, there it is, to signify his zest for technology when he was teaching at the Bauhaus in Germany in the 1920s, where critically he allowed women to study whatever subject they wished, including the subjects previously reserved for men. And who wouldn't admire his courage after he arrived in the United States, when he set up not one but two design schools in Chicago and welcomed African Americans to them as students and teachers at a time when the Chicago education system was still segregated. Because wherever he was, and regardless of his own personal circumstances, which were very vulnerable at times, Moholy-Nagy remained optimistic, generous, subversive, curious, and completely committed to experimentation, whether he was pioneering the then new media of film and photography or investigating their impact on visual culture and daily life. Critically, he also, I believe, reinvented the practice of design by liberating it from the constraints of the professional role it had occupied since the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century, because he redefined it as an improvisational medium that was rooted in instinct, ingenuity, resourcefulness, and was open to everyone, in his book Vision in Motion. Moylinage was dying of leukemia when he wrote that book, but he was so determined to finish it that his wife Sybil would bring his photographs, drawings and notes to his hospital room so he could work on it between blood transfusions and x-rays. He died towards the end of 1946, and Vision in Motion was published the following year, and it presented an eclectic and empowering vision of design, which still seems remarkable now, so must have seemed incredible then. And he summed it up in the second chapter with the words, "Designing is not a profession, but an attitude." Now, I've always loved that phrase, even though designing, as he actually wrote it, seems rather quaint to us now. And I've always admired his conviction that design should, as he wrote, be transformed from the notion of a specialist function into a generally valid attitude of resourcefulness and inventiveness. And in short, that's what I believe post-industrial design will be. And his vision of design was, of course, rooted in his commitment to constructivism, which he encountered as a young artist in Budapest after World War I, because design was central to the work of the original constructivists, like Alexander Rodchenko and his wife Varvara Stepanova, and their friends in Russia in the late 1910s and early 1920s, like Eldizitsky and Lyubov Popova. They believed that artists, designers, and scientists should collaborate with industry to build a fairer, more progressive society by creating new things for the new life, as Popova described it. And this was the vision of design that Moylinage introduced to the Bauhaus after his arrival there in the mid-1920s and to the new design schools he founded in Chicago. And I chose the phrase "design as an attitude" as the title of my new book, and here is the cover, both as a tribute to Moylinage and because I believe that his concept of design as an attitudinal discipline, steeped in experimentation, is a defining force in contemporary design, when a new generation of designers, and of course many of you are among them, professional and otherwise, are seizing their chance to work independently in pursuit of their own social, political, and environmental goals. But before I explain what I mean by attitudinal design in the contemporary sense, I'll begin by describing what I believe design to be, because of course design is a complex and elusive phenomenon. It's adopted many different meanings at different times and in different contexts, and as a result, it's been prone and still is prone to muddles, misunderstandings, and cliches. But in all of its manifold guises, I believe it's always had one elemental role, and that is as this, an agent of change that can help us to make sense of what is happening and to turn it to our advantage. Because design is one of our most critical tools in enabling us to interpret changes of any type: social, political, economic, scientific, technological, ecological, cultural, whatever, and to ensure that they'll affect us positively rather than negatively. And design was practiced in this instinctively resourceful way, the one advocated by Moylinage, for centuries, if not millennia, long before a word was coined to describe it. Because whenever human beings have adapted to changes in their lives, whether by fabricating new objects or structures, or moderating their own behavior or other people's, they've engaged with design, but mostly they did so intuitively and unknowingly. Prehistoric men and women acted as designers on the necessity as the mother of invention principle by sharpening stones and bones to use as weapons and tools, and moulding clay they found on riverbanks into vessels to eat or drink from. And many subsequent design feats have been equally instinctive. Take the white flag. It was officially acknowledged as a symbol of surrender in the late 19th century, but had been used for that purpose as early as the ancient Chinese Han Dynasty in the 3rd century BC, and had always conveyed the same meaning. Another ancient symbol is this one, the raised fist, which has been recognized as a sign of strength and unity in the face of adversity since its adoption as an emblem by Ishtar, the Mesopotamian goddess of love, sex, and war over 3,000 years ago. And the same gesture has been chosen as a symbol of a succession of political and activist movements, from early 1900s campaigners for workers' rights and the Russian revolutionaries, including the constructivists, to the Black Power and women's movements in the 60s and 70s, and more recently by activists like these in Black Lives Matter. Nor has design ever lost its prehistoric necessity as the mother of invention role as a useful tool for resourceful people in challenging circumstances. Take the early 18th century pirates like this one. This is a particularly barbaric British pirate called Blackbeard. Now, in the very early 18th century, he and dozens of other pirates all over the world started flying a flag like the one in the top right-hand corner of the slide that bore the macabre symbol of a human skull and a pair of crossed bones. And this they adopted as a symbol of terror. They'd calculated that at a time when maritime trade was booming, they could maximize their profits by using as little ammunition as possible during their raids and not risking injury or death to their crew. And so they adopted the Jolly Roger or the skull and crossbones as a symbol which was intended to terrify the ships they planned to attack into surrendering on sight, thereby, thank you, maximizing their profits and avoiding waste. Now, another example is the 19th century British healthcare reformer Florence Nightingale. She volunteered to work in military clinics in Turkey during the Crimean War and was horrified to discover that more patients were dying from infections they contracted in the filthy, fetid wards than they were from their battle wounds. And she drew on the research of a doctor and social reformer working in Manchester, John Roberton, who was designing and building model hospitals and convalescent homes that were clean, safe, and airy. So Florence Nightingale adapted his principles for military use and campaigned the British government for funding to implement them. And in her campaign, she used diagrams like this, these pie charts, which were absolutely pioneering at the time, because she was trying to convince the government by marshalling very complex arguments involving a lot of statistics. So she used information design in a very intuitive and instinctive way to communicate her arguments clearly and convincingly. But by then, in the 19th century, the design process was being applied knowingly and systematically to manufacturing huge quantities of goods of consistent quality. And the practice of design was formalized with the introduction of training programs, specialist schools, and clearly defined methodologies. Design became professionalized during this era, and it achieved extraordinary things, but it was also restricted to a commercial role, generally executed under instruction from someone else. So whilst design did have great achievements in the industrial age, I also feel that it was diminished in some respects, certainly as a cultural force, and it was then that it was stereotyped as a promotional or styling tool, something that was concerned with surface appearance rather than substance. Now, there were always exceptions to this, like Moylinage and the constructivists, and another was this character, the maverick US designer, engineer, and activist Buckminster Fuller, who inveighed against the environmental damage caused by industrialization as early as the 1920s, and devoted his long and productive working life to trying to stop it. Design was also deployed as a form of political protest, as it had been with the raised fist. Young artists and designers like these occupied the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris during the May 1968 student riots. Of course, it's their 50-year anniversary this month, to establish the Atelier Populaire, where they produced hundreds of posters as what they called weapons in the service of the struggle, and they literally squatted in the École des Beaux-Arts to set up the workshop there. And another cause benefited from the resourcefulness of the anonymous members of the Grand Fury Collective, who designed banners and billboards like this to raise awareness of AIDS worldwide during the 80s and 90s. Grand Fury also sought to redress misconceptions about AIDS with courage and wit, as in their slogan, "Kissing doesn't kill, greed and indifference do." Now, inspiring though such projects are, attitudinal design was very much on the margins of the design community for much of the last century. Yet in recent years, it's experienced a radical transformation into the fluid, expansive, and open-minded medium that Moyle-Linage described. The chief catalyst, apart from the determination and ingenuity of the individuals involved, is the plethora of digital tools that have transformed the practice and possibilities of design. Now, most of them are fairly basic and inexpensive, but if they're applied imaginatively, can be remarkably useful in helping designers to operate independently. For example, the availability of crowdfunding platforms has been a boon in helping designers to raise capital, as is the possibility of securing grants from the growing number of charitable foundations that support social and humanitarian design, like Acumen, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Candida Fund. To put this in context, one of the boldest attitudinal design projects, this one, the Ocean Cleanup, a non-profit founded by the young Dutch design engineer Boyan Slat to tackle one of the biggest pollution problems of our time by clearing plastic trash from our oceans, has raised over $30 million from crowdfunding and grants in little over 3 years. That's an enormous amount of capital for a young designer. Boyan Slat was in his early 20s and hadn't graduated when he raised his first $2 million from crowdfunding. So it's an enormous sum of money to raise. Designers can also manage huge quantities of complex data on basic computers and, of course, use social media to raise awareness of their work, flush out collaborators, suppliers and fabricators, and clinch funding or generate media coverage. Now, individually, each of these changes would have had a positive impact on design culture, as they have on many other fields. But collectively, they've been transformational, and it's just as well, because this is a moment when we desperately need design's power as an agent of change at an incredibly turbulent time when we face tumultuous changes on so many fronts. It's a terrifying situation which was summed up brilliantly by one of my favourite banners at the Women's March on London, and it's this. Most of the signs were protesting about one cause or another, and this one summed up the situation very basically, but I thought very aptly. So here are just a few of the challenges for design now that could have been on that sign. Climate change, obviously, and its dire political, economic, and environmental consequences of parts of Africa face the worst famines in their history. The growing imbalance of wealth between rich and poor, old and young, distrust of the political establishment, the rise of intolerance, prejudice, bigotry, Brexit in my own country, and the crisis of social justice worldwide. Ever more terrifying terrorist and cyber attacks and killing sprees, and the deepening refugee crisis as tens of millions of people have been forced to flee their homes and are struggling to rebuild their lives. And then, of course, there's the traditional role of industrial design that I believe is more important than ever before, interpreting advances in science and technology. Because after 2 decades in which technologies that would have once seemed like sci-fi props have been part of our daily lives and now completely familiar, we need design to help us to identify constructive uses for advances like neuromorphic and quantum computing, blockchain, cryptocurrencies, AI, and all the other advances that we don't just know will be part of the near future, but are part of our lives already. And urgently, we need design to help us to avoid their dangers. Because identifying useful applications for seemingly inscrutable technologies was one of design's core roles in the industrial age, but it's taken on a new urgency now, given the power of the next wave of advances and their potential to wreak damage. Witness the current paranoia and all the media scare stories about artificial intelligence. Now, I'm not going to pretend for a minute that design is a panacea for any of the major problems, like the refugee crisis, but it can help us to address them intelligently, responsibly, and constructively. And the new attitudinal designers are already making great progress by grappling with those challenges and more. And I'm now going to give a few examples. Now, I'm going to start with the amply funded and arguably already over-publicised ocean cleanup. This was the scene when Boyan Slat, there he is, he's still only 26, mounting the podium, when he announced that they'd raised over $30 million of funding so could accelerate their tests and prototypes and would go live in the Pacific this summer. And as you can see, it looks like a massive convention. So it shows how much impact a beguiling design cause can cause. It was founded in 2013 when Boyan Slat, who was then 19, went on a diving holiday to Greece and was horrified to discover that he saw more plastic bags in the ocean than fish. So his vision is to design the world's largest floating structure to collect, contain and clear plastic trash from the huge garbage patches in the Pacific. It'll then be taken to dry land where it can be recycled responsibly. Now, his plans have been fiercely criticised by scientists and environmentalists alike, yet his $30 million has enabled him to complete design, prototyping and initial tests in Europe and to go live in the Pacific this summer. A very different way of using design to combat climate change is ore streams, and it's an ongoing research project by the Italian designers Simone Farasin and Andrea Tremacchi of Studio Forma Fantasma to chart the gigantic, often illicit, global trade in electronic and digital waste that often ends up in toxic dumps like this one outside Accra, the capital of Ghana. Now, as well as documenting the shipment of waste from country to country, Andrea and Simone, who began by studying product design in the conventional way and still do produce products on an industrial and a bespoke basis, but through their design research projects have imbued their work with great political urgency. They've collaborated with scientists, environmentalists, manufacturers, recyclers, and even Interpol to assess the social and economic impact of digital waste. They've also identified practical ways in which designers and manufacturers can ensure that their products will be easier to recycle responsibly. For example, by not using black rubber to cover potentially valuable copper wire, because the colour black is invisible to the sensors in recycling plants, so all that copper wire is sent to landfill. And currently, fewer than a third of all the digital devices in the European Union are responsibly recycled. So that shows how much there is to be gained. Another focus for attitudinal design is the refugee crisis, as designers are rising to the challenge both of providing emergency support for the record numbers of people who've been forced to leave their homes for fear of conflict or persecution, and also helping them to settle into their new communities. And one of my favourite projects is this one. It's in Treviso, a city in northern Italy, and it's called Talking Hands. It was founded last year by a graphic designer, Fabrizio Orettini, whose aim was to enable some of the hundreds of migrants and asylum seekers who are living in a largely derelict Siemens hostel in Treviso to use their time productively by learning new skills. So Fabrizio roped in friends who are designers who volunteered to run workshops to pass on their own skills to the refugees and migrants in Treviso. And some 50 young male refugees living in the area now go to regular craft classes that they run. So they learn new skills and enhance existing ones, like carpentry and embroidery. The products they make are sold at local fairs and markets, so they make some money from that, and they make additional income by repairing and restoring furniture for local people. So not only does Talking Hands offer an opportunity for them to learn useful skills and improve their chances of employment, it enables them to use their time productively and to engage with the local community, many of whom were deeply suspicious or sceptical of the sudden refugee population, to say the least. And when the volunteers learnt that the refugee and migrant communities were suffering from severe food shortages last Christmas, they opened a food bank at Talking Hands and asked local people for donations. And it's testimony to the progress they had made that the response was phenomenal. They were actually sending the food to food banks in other cities. They had so much of it. Now, equally ambitious in its objectives is a project from this group, Forensic Architecture, which is a design research agency founded in London, of course, by the Israeli architect Eyal Weizman, to identify and analyse data from diverse sources to uncover the truth about climate and war crimes and other human rights abuses. So this is another incredible collaborative exercise because forensic architecture uses design processes and tools, but works with coders, filmmakers, lawyers, archaeologists, scientists, and other experts to reconstruct scenes of criminality or conflict. Whether it's to establish the truth about a devastating attack on a Syrian hospital or why more than 60 migrants were left to die when a boat drifted in the Mediterranean. And the results are used as evidence in official investigations, policy reviews, and legal cases in the hope of securing justice for the victims and preventing repetitions. And so compelling is forensic architecture's work that last week the group were nominated for Britain's biggest contemporary art prize, the Turner Prize. So just as Moyle-Nagy urged designers to engage with other disciplines by forging collaborations with specialists from those fields, he also envisaged the reverse happening, and for those people to experiment directly with design, as forensic architecture, the ocean cleanup, and former Phantasma's collaborators do. Now, an example is the British social scientist Hilary Cottam, and this is one of her projects, which I'll describe in a minute. Now, she trained as a social scientist, then worked as a development economist for the World Bank in Africa, where she ran major water projects for the World Bank. And she realised that some projects failed and some projects succeeded and felt it was responsible to analyse why. And she realised that the commonest denominator was the quality of their design. Intelligently designed projects tended to do well, and poorly designed projects failed. Now, that might sound like common sense to us, but it didn't to a social scientist and development economist like Hilary, who knew nothing about design. She had never really heard it discussed in such a context. So back in Britain, she decided to investigate design, and she founded a social enterprise called Participle, whose mission is to reinvent the welfare state by designing new solutions for acute social problems like aging, homelessness, isolation, and unemployment. And one of Participle's projects is this one, The Circle. And this is a project to provide a more effective way of providing help and services for elderly people in local communities. And it began in one London borough by forming circles that functioned as sort of a combination of concierge services, self-help groups, and social clubs. And critically, the help that's offered to the members comes from other members as well as external providers. So people aren't just benefiting from support from the circle, they're being active supporters. It has been so successful that it's been introduced to a dozen other boroughs throughout the UK and reinvented there to suit local conditions. Now, traditionally, a designer's role in tackling societal problems like ageing would be limited to producing websites or brochures explaining what social scientists like Hilary, politicians and economists had decided to do. But Hilary has embedded designers in the decision-making process by assembling cross-disciplinary teams that are always led by a designer, generally a product or graphic designer, use design language and adhere to the design process, because she's convinced that you get a better result. Now, Participle folded last year after a decade of experiments, but its projects, like this one, this is a circle in North England, continue to be run by their local communities, and Participle's work continues to influence other social design groups worldwide. Now, an equally ingenious example of attitudinal design from ingenue designers is Sehat Kahani, which means the story of health. and this is a service that seeks to improve healthcare for women in Pakistan. Pakistan suffers from a severe shortage of women doctors, even though more women study medicine at university than men. This is because shortly after graduation, Pakistani women tend to come under acute social and family pressure to marry and have children, and also under pressure to give up their careers. So as a result, there are far too few female doctors to care for the Pakistani women who don't wish to be treated by men. And two Pakistani women doctors, Sara Karam and Ifat Zafar, use their instinctive design ingenuity to address this by developing a network of teleclinics to enable female doctors like them, and the woman you can see on the screen, to practice from their homes by examining patients on live video links. They then liaise with local nurses, like the lady in blue and white, on the treatment of the patients. Now, the concept was tested in Karachi in 2014, and it ran into lots of problems, ranging from inadequate electricity, which caused power shortages in rural clinics, to patients' doubts that the doctor speaking to them on the screen really was qualified. But solutions were found, and the network is now being expanded throughout Pakistan and has had a phenomenal impact on the quality of healthcare for women there already. Indeed, the principal beneficiaries of attitudinal design may well turn out to be the populations of remote rural areas of developing countries like Pakistan that rarely benefited from conventional design practice in the past. Because some of the most exciting breakthroughs, particularly in the design of interconnected Internet of Things technologies, are in African countries, where more people have access to cell phones than to clean running water, thereby enabling ingenious design projects to dramatically expand access to sorely needed services. And an example is this one. It's Peak Retina, and it's a smartphone adapter developed by Peak Vision, a group of doctors and designers in Kenya, that enable eye problems like cataracts and glaucoma to be diagnosed remotely. Before Peak Retina, anybody in the country who thought they had problems with their eyes had to travel to the bigger cities in Kenya because they were the only places where the hospitals were equipped with the specialist staff and equipment that was needed to diagnose them. The journeys were often expensive and difficult and arduous, and people were reluctant to embark on them, so they tended not to seek treatment. But Peak Retina is a very ingenious solution because health workers in isolated rural areas can test patients' eyes at local clinics. They send the data for analysis on a cellular connection to those well-equipped hospitals that are often hundreds of miles away. The specialists there then decide what treatment is required, so the patients are saved from having to make long, expensive, possibly pointless journeys, and as a result are far likelier to have regular eye tests. And other remote diagnostic devices have been developed in Africa to improve the treatment of other health issues, including heart conditions. Collectively, these innovations, including the expansion of telemedicine, should have a huge impact on the quality of local healthcare in the most remote, economically deprived rural areas where it's historically been least adequate. Because design hasn't traditionally been seen as an obvious solution to healthcare shortages, dysfunctional social services, plastic pollution, or seeking justice, nor were independent designers expected to raise over $30 million to mount epic ecological ventures like the ocean cleanup, or doctors like Karam and Zafar to recognize that design could be useful in their work. Even now, more people are likelier to perceive design as a styling device or as a reason why so much plastic trash is poisoning the oceans than as a means of clearing it away. And if Moulinage's ambitious eclectic vision of design is to be realized, those stereotypes have to be quashed. And the only way for this to happen is for design, attitudinal or otherwise, to prove its worth in new terrain. Why else would politicians, bureaucrats, NGOs and investors consider it to be capable of helping the victims of war crimes to secure justice or to develop more efficient global systems of managing digital waste? Now, I believe that design has the potential to be a powerful tool to tackle all of these issues in collaboration with other disciplines, but only if it is deployed intelligently, sensitively, and with extreme care and precision. Because quite rightly, design will only be empowered to play a more prominent role in our lives if it demonstrates that it deserves to do so by winning the necessary public confidence and political support. And this is only going to happen if there are fundamental changes in design practice. Now, one of them is to interpret design in its broadest strategic sense as a process of change management and a series of skills that can be applied in different contexts to address the major problems I've talked about. Another is that design needs to become more compassionate. In the industrial age, the modernist era, design tended to be design by certainties. Now, it could be argued that this was essential at the time to achieve mass industrialization, mass housing, mass transportation, and so on. And those qualities tended to make it plucky and optimistic, but also prone to arrogance and, at its worst, insensitivity. Empathy, I believe, will be an increasingly important quality for design in future. Design also needs to be more generous and open in forging true collaborations with specialists from other disciplines and making the most of them as learning opportunities, doing the same to people who use design and, thanks to 3D printing and other digital production technologies, will play increasingly important roles in the design process in future. And finally, there needs to be an acceptance that as designers and design projects become increasingly ambitious, the consequences of failure will escalate. Because just as every thoughtfully planned and executed design project represents a step forward, each sloppily designed flop is a major setback. And the ocean cleanup may prove to be a critical test case when it goes live in the Pacific this summer. If the critical scientists and environmentalists are right and it fails, it's going to be much, much harder, not only for Boyan Slat, but other digitally empowered designers to secure financial and political backing in future. Conversely, their credibility will soar if the ocean cleanup succeeds in completing all or even part of what it describes as the largest cleanup in history. Either way, Boyan Slat and every other attitudinal designer would benefit immensely from the services of another of my favourite recent design endeavours, the immersive research conducted by the architect Jan Willem Petersen. Now, he founded Specialist Operations as a design research agency in Amsterdam, and his first project was to go here. This is a city in Uruzgan, which is a remote rural province of Afghanistan, a very desolate region that has been stricken after decades of warfare. And after the last conflict in Afghanistan, the Dutch government spent hundreds of millions of euros on a massive post-conflict reconstruction program, and this is some of the infrastructure that they built: housing, police stations, hospitals, clinics, schools, roads, even an airport. Now, Petersen decided to go to Uruzgan to find out whether all that investment was worthwhile. He spent months travelling around the region. In 2015, he learnt local dialects. He even grew a beard to make him look less conspicuous. Now, all of the projects in this programme, it was called Task Force Uruzgan in the Netherlands, were designed and constructed with the best of intentions. Yet his investigation concluded that 30% of them had serious flaws, which would require urgent, possibly expensive repairs. 20% of them did actually serve a useful purpose. They were well designed and were fulfilling a constructive function. But 50% of them had either been abandoned completely or were barely functional, almost always because their Western designers had failed to take account of local conditions and the local context. So an example is that a village stopped construction of a school after learning that the Dutch had decided to build one because they hadn't bothered to find out whether local people were doing so already. The Dutch-funded building turned out to be so badly designed and built that it had to be abandoned, so the village doesn't have a school. Another example was a police station where the Western architect insisted on building a pitched roof, regardless of the fact that the chief of police had warned him that it couldn't cope with the local climate. And in any case, the police force needed a flat roof to do surveillance of the area. So the pitch roof was a disaster and had to be expensively replaced. Now, Peterson published his findings in a 300-page report, which was presented to the Dutch government, and there was a parliamentary inquiry into the programme. Post-conflict reconstructions like this one are hugely expensive, yet the results are seldom seen in the countries that pay for them. And the Dutch government was unusually enlightened in paying attention to the project. I very much doubt that their counterparts in Britain would do so. Most analyses of projects like this are conducted by auditors or development economists, and they do a great job in their own fields. But they may miss the design flaws that can cause serious problems. Peterson used his design knowledge to spot them and to suggest ways to avoid repetitions. Now, work like his, because I suspect an increasingly important role for designers in the post-industrial age will be literally to police design, to make sure it's fit for purpose. Work like this could prove absolutely critical in assessing the efficacy of preventing yet more ambitious and expensive design debacles in future and ensuring that the new generation of ambitious, independent, attitudinal designers fulfill their true potential, just as Laszlo Molinage would have wished. Thank you. Well, one of the reasons I love coming to design schools is that the best ones are always, I find, very entrepreneurial and enterprising. So I have been really impressed by the speed with which design schools have embraced social and humanitarian design, conceptual design, design research, all these disciplines that have always been sort of on the boundaries of design, but have become increasingly important in recent years. So, for example, you often come to the Milan Furniture Fair, to Milan Design Week, to exhibit every year. And when I used to go to the student shows, this is of all the schools that are there, maybe 10 years ago, and you'd ask the students what their ambitions were, it was generally to be the next Philippe Starck, but to become richer, more famous, and get more media coverage. Now, they all want to save the world. There are amazing environmental, affordable housing, humanitarian, social design projects. And I think it's fantastic. I mean, if you believe in design, then it stands to reason that society needs the best possible designers. And I think the more different ways there are to practice design, the more exciting and seductive it will be as a discipline, and the likelier we'll be to get them.
Thank you. Anyone else?
To ask a question then. I would like to know, does anyone have an example of design projects in Israel that you believe are ingenious, resourceful, making a powerful contribution to the sort of issues I've been talking about?
Yeah, I think no?
So I'll give an example for one of our projects. We were charged with improving the quality of life for residents of the Neve Sha'anan neighborhood in southern Tel Aviv. which is a neighborhood built for around 4,000 residents, and today is home to around 40,000 residents. 90% of them are immigrants. 60% of them are illegal immigrants or refugees from Sudan and Eritrea. And the work we did was around creating a more, improving the relationship between the Israeli residents and the immigrant residents. And we used design in order to lead the whole process and structure the whole process.
Many design thinking. Anyone else? Yeah, Anat?
I just want to say that you don't hear many people answering because there's so many, I think in Israel there's a lot of it's kind of a counter action to the fact that we live in a conflict society. So I think there's a lot of work in the design area trying to change the environment that we live in. And I think especially in the last 10 years, it's been not only one of the topics or the major topics in many of the Btzalel departments, but it's also a methodology. It's not only a topic. So many courses are built on the idea of design as a civil action. She's right.
I'd like to ask a question. I'm curious, you were talking about raising the stakes with regards to failure, which, even if we look between the disciplines of product design and architecture, sort of having your chair fail had different consequences than having a building fail. And I'm sort of curious whether you see either in educational institutions or in general in the organization, in the way things work, whether we're beginning to create more buffers between our ideas and the actual possibility of catastrophical failure.
Well, I think in general, design culture doesn't discuss failure enough. So that isn't a comment specifically about education. It's about the whole design community and the critics, the curators, the people around it. And I think that design has struggled to prove itself, its worth as a discipline, for so long that throughout the 20th century, the focus was very much on good design. I mean, the Museum of Modern Art in New York devoted decades to good design exhibitions. That was its curatorial methodology for design. And yet, when you talk to people outside the design community, if, for somebody like me, I write for a general readership, I'm trying to prove design's importance, it's often so much easier to do so by giving an example of disastrous design than it is by lauding its wonderful qualities. And I think, so an example would be the infamous butterfly ballot in the 2000 US presidential election in Palm Beach County, Florida, where a local voting official there were so many candidates on the ballot paper, the type was so tiny, she was worried that elderly people with visual impairments wouldn't be able to read the candidates, so might check the wrong box, and so spread them out across 2 pages and inadvertently created such a confusing ballot paper that it's thought that Al Gore would have been President of the United States had all the votes that were given to a wrong candidate and not him actually been allotted to him. So that's a spectacular example of bad design and the impact it can have on our lives. But I think that when you're talking about technologies like artificial intelligence, the consequences of bad design are really horrific, much more akin to architecture going wrong than a chair going wrong. If you think of some recent examples, several US police forces have used artificial intelligence to develop software programs to help them predict crime. And they ended up over-policing entirely respectable African-American neighborhoods, moving all their resources away from other neighborhoods. So criminals realized this was happening, went to the unprotected neighborhoods and cleaned up pretty efficiently. And of course, the African American neighborhoods felt persecuted, stereotyped, relations with the police broke down. This caused appalling problems. It was because nobody had realized that the data being fed into the AI program was all based on historic crime statistics that paid no relation to current circumstances. So I think when you're looking at designers developing really potentially powerful technologies like that, the damage that can be caused if the consequences aren't properly thought through really is colossal.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We'll thank you, Alice.
Thank you.